Thanks for taking the time to talk about your work, Grace. So, just to introduce ourselves, I'm Helen Pheby, and I was the Associate Director of Programme at Yorkshire Sculpture Park when we invited you to be the Working Class Creative Database Artist in Residence with Jim Brooke. And I first saw your work at Sunnybank Mills as part of the One to Watch show and was really excited by it. And it's absolutely brilliant to see how you have really developed your practice and created a lot of work in the time that we've known each other. Do you want to say a little bit about your most recent residency and some of the work that you've been making on that, and maybe how that is part of your entire practice, and also maybe a little bit about where you think it might go in the future?
Yes, so I recently finished a residency at Yorkshire Art Space with their testing ground programme, which gives artists 2 months in their old gallery space, as well as a fee and materials and all the other support that comes along with it. I was there in April and May, and that was really exciting. I felt that I hadn't been able to sit and think with my work for that kind of time for since I was probably at university.
Yeah.
And it felt really valuable to be able to reflect, particularly around sort of, I guess, the traces of labour, and the environments that are around, like, sort of, I guess, blue collar environments,
Yeah.
in particular.
And you mentioned university. When and where were you at uni? When did you graduate?
I was at Sheffield Hallam and I graduated in 2023.
And you've stayed on in Sheffield.
Yes, yeah, stayed on in Sheffield. Yeah.
And so how did you approach the residency? Was it with the point of view of making as much as you could or having a bit of dwell time? I'm also conscious that you work pretty much full time as well, and how all that kind of came together, really.
Yeah. Well, I scrapped what I proposed on the residency about 2 days in, which was scary, but definitely the right thing. I think when I sort of get these opportunities, or they feel like opportunities, I guess, to
Yeah.
make work, I sort of I've got to make the biggest thing possible. It's got to be, the most difficult thing and most arduous thing I could possibly do. Um, and I'll become fixated on an object, or an idea, and will just disregard anything else in the process.
Yeah.
Which I think I sort of see similarities with, I guess, sort of like my dad's labour, for example, of, he's a welder, and he's not, when I've tried to speak to him about his work, he's not conscious of the labour that he does. It's
Yeah.
just a means to an end. And I think I definitely have that within my work, where I get this like golden ticket thing, and I've got to make that, and that'll be it. And I can sell it, and I'll be a millionaire, or all this thing, and that never comes. I make the work. It's like the bronze pub stall. I
Yeah.
make I make the work, and then it just doesn't. It's never enough. There has to be more.
Yes.
So I think it was really good of me to sit with that uncomfortable feeling, because it was uncomfortable to be like, actually, I'm not going to play into this thing that I do, and I'm going to be an artist, and I'm going to sit around and think. I'm going to think, and I'm going to regard that as work. And then that's, I guess, how I produced this whole other installation whilst on the residency. And I made so much more work, and like had valuable ideas, rather than just focusing on the labour, even though
Yeah.
I still did a lot of that. But yeah.
And that's a really interesting insight. And the working class creative database is self-organizing.
Mhm.
And I think so the Arts Council for a little while now have identified class as a protected characteristic in the
Mhm.
same way that ethnicity or gender or faith, but it's not actually enshrined in law. And the way that you're talking about being accepting the fact that work can also not involve physical labor.
Mhm.
I think there's a lot I think that's really at the nub of your practice as well, and of the way that you're thinking about your background, your place in the world, and the value that is put on different types of work.
Yeah, because I'm guilty of that and like not seeing the value in some work, but then sort of, and I guess something I thought about, I was thinking about the residency was like this idea of time,
Mm.
um, and sort of like the value of time and time in different contexts. So I was having a conversation with the curator about this, and I was saying, if you had someone who'd been 40 years the same director of a gallery, it would be somewhat frowned upon and you'd be questioning that person and that institution and sort of, but then if you have someone who's been a welder for 40 years, it's met with respect.
Yes.
Um, and like the, I don't know, the difference in that. And I feel like sitting between those two worlds. And I guess as well within the residency, there was I started thinking a lot about like religion. And I have this sort of like it started at Yorkshire Sculpture Park actually.
Right.
Sort of this like Venn diagram in my head of sort of like work and religion and like churches and factories and this like the similarities between the two. And so like the work that I made in this residency, it was very because there wasn't a lot of physical labor going on and there was a lot of reflection. It was very quiet
Mm.
work. Um, which obviously like just contrasts the material that I'm working with, sort of, like the metal offcuts, like the gloves, everything. It's
Yeah.
um and just thinking about this like silence,
Mm.
this vow of silence and reflecting on how as a child, I had to be quiet all the time because my dad worked nights.
Right.
So
Yeah.
if like I'd be getting up to go to school and I had to be quiet because he'd just gotten in
Yeah.
and like I'd get home from school, he'd be just finishing off sleeping, so
Yeah.
I'd still have to be quiet. Um, but and I also like never really saw him because he was always at work.
Yeah.
Um, like I'd get home from school and as I got older, like I wouldn't see him at all really because I'd stay out later and he'd be leaving. And we just like would never see each other. But I still had to be quiet for this sort of like labor that was being undertaken and it was like this silent provider almost of
Yes.
like food and clothes and everything, but I never saw them but still had to like undertake something for them. I can feel it now, like like my mom still says, like if we speak on the phone she's like, quiet, your dad's in bed, and it's like we all just know that we have to be quiet, and it's so like weird, and like trying to explain that to people like this, I can like feel like the tension in my chest of that, and like that sensation is so weird. um and it's quite a unique experience to reflect on, I think.
Yes.
um
Yeah,
so
I
yeah,
think
that
that is all
came in.
part of like the evidence of how particular bodies are in the labour market and how that
Hmm.
affects their bodies and then how it affects the people around them as well. Um, and you talked just then about the materials that you use. Do you tend to use materials from blue collar work or that would be associated with blue?
I use I call everything like a found material.
Yeah,
So and it's sort of like such a wide variety of the materials I pick up. So I have like some old welding gloves. So the welding gloves in here with the handle, they're all right-handed gloves.
right.
Um, and it's because when you're welding, usually the left hand glove will wear out quicker. It's
Huh.
because you hold the tool with your right hand.
Yeah,
Um, and you hold the material with your left, so the left hand glove wears out. And I think that's so interesting how we like replace this object over and over again, and it does the same thing, becomes different. And yeah, and obviously you have the Caro offcuts
yes.
as well
So
from
this
your park.
is steel that the Anthony Caro family very kindly donated to Yorkshire Sculpture Park when Sir Anthony passed away. Absolutely with the view that the next generation of artists would be able to access it and to use it. And I think what's really poignant about that is that Anthony Caro, when David Smith died, the US sculptor, who Caro was friends with and respected and admired. When David Smith died, Caro was given his steel material. So there's this thread that runs through nearly 100 years actually of
Yeah.
transatlantic sculpture making, which not to make and it's not precious material, you know, it's
Yeah, that was something I really got into in the residency, because when I got the steel, I originally intended to use it for something else.
yeah.
And then sort of I placed it along a wall just because I needed somewhere to go. And then I stood back and I was like, oh, that's done the thing that I needed it to do without me doing anything. And there was a lot of times with that in the residency where um I'd be like, I'm gonna do this, and then I'd end up doing something to contribute towards that, and I'd be like, actually, that's done
Yeah.
now. And I kept kind of like stopping and starting with stuff, but through that I made better work.
Yes.
But with
And
the
do you tend
cargo,
to
sorry.
think you're making in that way? Do you tend to, rather than necessarily, so it sounds like you might have a preconceived idea of what you imagine the finished piece is going to look like or be in the world, but then as you're doing it, it's telling you something different.
Yeah, definitely. And I, me as someone who's been raised to like work, 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 I find that really annoying. But then as an artist, I'm like learning to accept that that's really good, and that I that my subconscious really does come into my work, and that I'm more intuitive than I give myself credit for.
Yes.
Um, but like with the yeah, with the steel, I kept calling it this like cultural scrap. Um, it
Yeah,
was
really
just
nice.
it was just this sort of scrap metal, and I didn't entirely understand where it'd come from at the time. And then afterwards, it's like, oh, right, okay, I've kind of got this steel now, and I sort of have to. I'm not going to use it for what I was, and it exists as an object in
Yes.
its own right. Um, and when people would visit the residency, I'd either get like two reactions. People like, oh, it's a good bit of scrap metal you got there. Or when I'd explain the context, people like, oh, wow, so oh, wow, amazing. They start taking photos and
Yes.
it was just still this scrap steel. And that's all it is, but it has this sort of legacy now attached to it.
Yes.
Um, and I said to people a couple of times, I was like, I could be lying, like I could just be making this up. But I found that really interesting. I guess also as a woman, I'm conscious in my work that it's really influenced by like my dad's labor.
Yeah.
And I guess like also seeing that again, um, you know, sort of having this other male laborer's work,
Yes.
um, that I now am just carrying around with me.
Yeah.
It's something I do in my practice, just carry heavy things around. And it's like with all this metal, it's like sometimes oh, I wish I was just a painter. I have to carry
Yeah.
things around all the time, and lug steel everywhere. Um, and it's that same thing again of carrying this
Yeah.
like burden almost,
Yeah.
it feels like to me. Like the weight of these ideas.
Also kind of the art historical weight in some ways as well, isn't it? It's almost that, you know, you've got the whole tradition of sculpture that came before you as well.
Mhm.
And that still kind of symbolizes that in many ways. And it's also, the Caro moment and the way that he made work and was perceived, rightly or wrongly, it was like a very masculine male.
Mhm.
Uh, and I don't know how that relates to you in your practice, if that's something that you find quite exciting to take that on.
Yeah, it's exciting and daunting. I think because it's sort of it's interesting to see how I will carry it with me. I think with like a lot of my work, I sort of end up carrying objects around with me for so long. Like something that really think I might be done with now is Imperial leather soap.
Right.
And I've carried that with me. When I went to uni, my mom gave me like a 4 pack of Imperial
Yeah.
leather soap. And I just had to keep it, and I didn't know why at the time. And I've moved house like 9 times in the past 5 years, and every time I've moved, I've had to carry this Imperial leather soap with me, and I've just been looking at it like it's still in its wrapping. Like I'm looking at a one right now, and I just never really understood why. And I was like, right, I'm going to bring it to this residency and I'm going to figure it out.
Yes.
Um, and sort of like, yeah, so it's been good to see how I can translate objects.
Yes.
And so I'm almost with the steel, I know I'm not done with it. And I'm
Yes.
looking forward to seeing where I go with it and kind of what path I take. And I think in terms of sort of like the burden of like this like male,
Mm.
um something I'm kind of thinking about in my work at the moment is how it's quite binary in how I word this. Like I don't think it is as binary as
Mm.
I'm gonna make it sound, but how like women may perceive um like their same histories differently to men,
Yeah.
um and sort of these shared histories we have, particularly around like class and labor.
Mhm.
um I feel like how women process them differently. So it's like when I've tried to talk about like family history with my mom, she's just like not interested at all. She's like, well, why would I care?
Mm.
So it's like I didn't know that like my great granddad was a coal miner.
Mhm.
And she just mentioned it and she's like, oh yeah, but whereas like I feel like sometimes people that it's like that identity. And I think like women have often had to always make something new and they've had to make do throughout these histories. Um, and I think like that definitely comes into my work, which I've not always been conscious of. Um, so yeah.
And you made a lot of work on the residency.
Yes,
Mm.
yeah.
And what do you think? So, how does the work you've made on this residency be a continuation or a departure from what you've made before, baby?
I felt like on this residency, my work really grew up a
Mm.
bit, which was really nice. Um, I felt like I've just become more confident
Yeah.
in like my process and acknowledging that I do have a process and that it is okay to hold on to imperial leather soap for
Yeah.
ages, and sort of that there is like a value in the way that I think. And I guess being like acknowledging my intuition because it
Yeah.
does work and it's always been there in my practice. I've just not given it that respect.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm also really conscious of I had a crit during the residency. And some people said that I was being quite elusive about why I collect things and like why I've got some objects and like why I was using some material. And because I was like, I don't know, like I just had to. And I want to like remain true to that. And I think like developing it's good to develop the language around my practice and I'm actively seeking to do that, but like keeping that intuition as the core of the practice is what makes it really fun for me because it just feels like I'm sort of playing with objects and they're kind of like tools for me to communicate like ideas.
Yeah.
um,
Is there something that you especially want people to take away from the experience of your work, or is it open to their interpretation?
um I mean it's obviously open to people's interpretation. I guess for me it's sort of that moment of like stopping almost, and like contemplation, which is a very religious act, I think.
Yeah.
But it also like spans across many things. I guess sort of spending time with the work. And something that I always enjoy when people do see my work is the stories that they tell me.
Yes.
And sort of like the memories that people bring up. So I've been using some chocolate as well in my residency. I did another thing that I don't really understand why at the time, but just obviously attached some kind of value to it. And then someone brought up that chocolate and the way that it blooms is quite similar to metal and the way that it rusts when it's
Yeah.
oxidized. So I've just gone on that whole rabbit hole now of like chocolate and metal, which is what I'm like looking to develop um soon. And so yeah, the values attached to that. So I guess like reflection is what I like to see people doing from my work.
And do you already have an idea of what's next in terms of both actually, but how the work might respond to plans as well?
Well, I have a residency coming up
Yeah,
with Abingdon Studios and Grundy Gallery and Factory International,
brilliant.
all in collaboration with each other. Um, I'm looking to work more in Birmingham as well.
That's
Um,
where you're from originally.
yes,
Yeah,
yeah. So I've been speaking with sort of people from East Side Projects recently, um, and as well as developing my own studio practice and making work around chocolate and metal. But yeah, I really wanted to also undertake some periods of research as well,
yeah,
and yeah, develop the language and research around my practice. Because every time I go and look for something, it's there apparently,
yeah.
which is really great, and quite affirming for my work.
It
Um,
doesn't feel like you're short of ideas.
no, definitely not. Yeah, I always think that I am, and then I sit and think I'll like write a to-do list, and I'm like, oh, actually, I've got so much to do, which is really fun. And yeah, it's like I'm really, I really trust that my practice will develop, um, and yeah, it's
But it
really,
is, isn't it? You can see just in the last 12 months, 18
yeah,
months, how much you've achieved, really.
yeah. I was talking with a friend actually last night about this and sort of how you never think about the things that you're doing when you're doing them, and it's always afterwards. And it's sort of like if I told me who was graduating, you know, I graduated, been graduating now for about 13 months. I think if I
Yes.
told myself that I'd have had the residency at Yorkshire Sculpture Park, I'd had, the residency at Yorkshire Art Space, this one in Blackpool, and just sort of, like all these like other projects and shows, I'd just be like, oh,
Yeah.
no, surely not.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's yeah, it's good to I know that I can see it, and it's just keeping that confidence.
Absolutely. And you've got a lot to be confident about. So, and yeah, let's check in another 13 months and see
Yes.
what
Yeah.
amazing things and unexpected things that you've achieved.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah. Hope.
Thanks, Grace.
Thanks.
Definitely.